The river had been whispering warnings for 3 days before it finally screamed. Levi Stone heard it in the deep of that fourth night, a sound like the earth itself cracking open along some ancient seam, and he was already scrambling out of his bunk when the first wave of black water punched through the door of his cabin and sent him sprawling against the far wall. He grabbed the wooden beam overhead with both hands, the cold so vicious it felt like a slap from something alive, and for one terrible, stretched-out moment he simply hung there in the darkness, while the water rose past his shins, past his knees, past his thighs, carrying with it every small and precious thing that constituted his existence on this earth. He heard his iron pot clang against the wall and disappear. He heard the stack of firewood topple. He heard the single-framed portrait of his late mother crack apart as it swept past his elbow in the dark. By the time gray dawn found him, Levi was sitting on the roof of what remained of his cabin, and the Barrow River had swallowed the rest of the Frontier Valley whole. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered from years of plowing and hauling, with dark hair pushed flat against his forehead by the rain that was still falling in sheets. He had calloused hands, a jaw that had not seen a razor in a week, and a pair of brown eyes that people who knew him said always looked a little sad even when he was laughing. He owned, as of that morning, the clothes on his back, a belt knife, and the roof under him, which he was fairly certain was not his for much longer. The valley below had become a lake. The Harrows Crossing settlement, the cluster of 40-odd homesteads and the small trading post and the livery and the grain barn, all of it had been reduced to rooftops and floating debris. He could see old Pemberton's wagon drifting south with the current, its canvas cover billowing like a slow sail. He could see the grain barn leaning at an angle that was not going to last another hour. And then he saw the woman clinging to a wagon wheel that was slowly turning in the current not 30 yards from him, her dark green fingers locked around the spokes with a grip that looked carved from iron, her head barely above the waterline. He did not think. That was the thing he remembered afterward, the utter absence of thinking. He saw a person in the water about to go under, and his body made a decision without consulting his mind. He stripped off his coat, sucked in a breath, and jumped. The current was brutal. It shoved him downstream the moment he entered it, a cold, dark fist that cared nothing for his intentions or his strength. He fought it with every muscle he had, swimming at an angle to cut across the flow rather than battle it straight on, and when his fingers finally found the rim of that wagon wheel, he locked on with the kind of grip that comes from pure, animal desperation. The woman stared at him. She was an orc, clearly, unmistakably, and she was looking at him with eyes the color of amber held up to firelight, eyes that were extraordinary in the gray wreckage of that morning. Her face was strong-boned and angular, with the slightly protruding lower jaw and the small, neat tusks at the corners of her mouth that marked her kind. Her skin was deep, warm green, a shade richer than pine needles, and her dark hair was plastered to her neck and shoulders. She was wearing a fitted leather bodice laced tightly over a rust-colored linen blouse, the laces cinched at the front to show the strong, feminine line of her figure, and dark travel trousers tucked into knee-high boots from which the water was trying very hard to drag her. She was beautiful in a way that struck him even through the cold and the terror, a fierceness in her face that was also somehow aching. She looked at his hand on the wheel. She looked at his face. She said nothing. "I am going to get you to that rooftop," he said, loud enough to be heard over the rush of water. "Can you hold on to me?" She said nothing for another moment. Then she said in a voice that was low and careful and accented in a way he had not heard before, "You are human." "I am," he said, "and that is my roof over there. Now can you hold on to me?" Something moved across her face, some calculation or decision too fast for him to read, and then she released one hand from the wheel and gripped his shoulder, and together, grinding and fighting against the current inch by inch, they got back to the rooftop. He hauled her up first. She did not need much hauling. She had arms like braided rope, and she pulled herself onto the shingles with a controlled, powerful grace that told him she was no stranger to hard physical work. Then she reached back and pulled him up by the wrist as if he weighed nothing remarkable, and they sat there together in the rain, both of them gasping, the floodwater churning 3 feet below. He looked at her. She looked at the water. "Thank you," she said after a while in that same careful voice. "You are welcome," he said. She turned and looked at him fully then, studying him the way a person studies something unexpected, something that does not fit the pattern they have been taught to expect. "Most humans would not have jumped in for an orc," she said. Levi rubbed water from his eyes and looked out at the ruined valley. "Well," he said, "I have had a rough morning and I am not presently in a position to be particular about who I share my roof with." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. "My name is Sharamph Ironhide," she said. "Levi Stone," he said. "This used to be my farm." She looked at the flooded valley, the drowned fields he had plowed for 4 years, the garden patch invisible under 6 feet of dark water, the smokehouse that was already halfway gone downstream. "I am sorry," she said, and she said it like she meant it, plainly and without decoration, and that was the first thing that surprised him about her. They stayed on that roof for most of that first day. The rain eased by mid-morning, and the water, while it did not recede, at least stopped rising. Levi had nothing to offer her in the way of food or warmth, and she offered nothing in the way of conversation for the first several hours. But the silence between them was not hostile. It was the silence of two people who were each conserving their energy for whatever came next. By afternoon he had learned, through the slow and careful exchange of words that people manage when they are both afraid and very tired, that Sharamph had been traveling alone through the valley when the flood hit. She had been heading west toward the border country beyond the Harrows Range. She did not say why, and he did not ask. She had been camped by the river's edge, which in retrospect had been a decision she was very clearly still processing with an expression of flat self-recrimination. "I read the water wrong," she said. "I have never read water wrong before." "The Barrow has not flooded this way in 40 years, Levi said. "The old-timers said it could. I did not believe them." She looked at him sideways. "You are younger than 40 years. 28, he said. She said nothing for a moment. "I am 26. When the water dropped enough toward dusk that the rooftop of the trading post was accessible by wading, they moved. Levi broke the lock on the trading post's upper storage hatch, and they climbed down into it. A space barely large enough to stand in but dry, with a crate of dried salt pork and some dusty blankets that the flood had not reached. He built a small fire in the iron brazier that old Marsh kept up there for just such emergencies, and when the light and warmth filled the space, he finally got a proper look at the woman sitting across from him, her dark hair beginning to dry in loose waves around her shoulders, her amber eyes reflecting the fire. She was remarkable looking. He noticed that with a kind of helpless clarity, the way you notice something true even when you did not particularly intend to look. She noticed him noticing. She did not look away. She held his gaze with a steadiness that was not defiance exactly, but was close enough to it that he understood. She was someone who had spent a great deal of her life being looked at in ways she did not enjoy, and she was waiting to see which kind of looking this was. He looked away first, reaching for the salt pork. "Hungry?" he said. She exhaled, and the slight tension in her shoulders eased. "Yes," she said. They ate. The fire crackled. Outside, the water moved in that particular way it does when it is beginning slowly to recede. "Where were you going?" he asked finally. "West, you said." She was quiet for a moment, turning a strip of dried pork over in her fingers. "There is work in the border towns," she said. "I am a blacksmith, trained under my clan's forge master for 8 years. The border towns need smiths, and they ask fewer questions than the eastern settlements." He looked at her hands then, which he probably should have done sooner, because they told a story. The callousing was not the general roughness of outdoor labor, but the specific, precise toughening that comes from handling hammer and tongs for years, the base of each finger, the heel of each palm, the particular wear pattern of someone who had spent thousands of hours at an anvil. "You left your clan?" he asked. "My clan left," she said, simply. flatly, without elaboration, and something in her voice made it very clear that she had already decided she was not going to explain that tonight. "All right," he said, and he did not push. That was the second thing that surprised her about him. The water was gone in 4 days. Gone is perhaps the wrong word. Receded is the better one, pulled back into the Barrow's channels and left behind it a valley that looked like the aftermath of some terrible argument between the land and the sky. Mud everywhere, a foot deep in places, broken fence posts, bloated livestock that Levi did not let himself look at too long. The grain barn had completely gone. The smokehouse was a ruin. His cabin, miraculously, was still standing, but when he waded through the mud to its door and pushed it open, he understood that standing was the most generous word that applied. The floor was warped and cracked. The furniture was destroyed. The stores were gone. The single window had been punched through by a floating beam and birds had already found the gap. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Sharamph came to stand beside him. She was taller than him by about 2 inches, which he had noticed on the roof and filed away without comment. She looked at the cabin and she looked at the mud fields and she looked at the distant, still murky line of the Barrow River, and then she said, "What will you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Rebuild, I suppose," he said. "I have no other options that make any kind of sense." She nodded slowly. "I can help," she said, "before I continue west while the road's dry." He looked at her. "You do not have to do that." "I know," she said. "I am offering." He thought about the fact that he had, alone, absolutely no realistic path to making this cabin livable before winter, which was 11 weeks away. He thought about the fact that her hands told him she knew how to work. He thought about the fact that she had nowhere to stay in this valley that was not his roof, because the trading post's owner, Old Marsh, had already shown up with his family in a wagon and started loading salvage to take to his brother-in-law's place in the next county. "The settlement will not be easy for you," he said, being honest. "People here are not," he paused, choosing the word, "accustomed." "I know what people are," she said, and her voice was dry and precise as a blade. "I want to be clear that I am not of the same mind as them," he said. "I want you to know that before you agree to anything." She looked at him for a long moment. "You jumped in a river for me," she said. "I know what you are." So they stayed. Together, without ceremony or negotiation beyond that brief exchange, they stayed. The early days of the rebuilding were hard in a way that was almost beautiful in its simplicity. There was so much to do that there was no time or energy left for anything complicated. Levi salvaged timber from the wreckage of the grain barn, hauling it plank by plank through the drying mud, while Sharamph assessed the structural damage to the cabin with a methodical eye that impressed him deeply. She had, she explained, helped build and repair her clan's forged structures for years, and a forged structure had to be sound or people died, which meant she had learned to think about load-bearing and joinery in ways that most people who simply built cabins did not. She showed him where the flood had undermined the foundation on the eastern side. She showed him where the main beam over the door had shifted and was now slightly off-true, which would cause the doorframe to slowly rack if not corrected. She showed him, with a kind of quiet authority that he found himself simply accepting without question, exactly which parts of the floor could be saved and which parts needed to come out entirely. "You know your business," he said, on the second afternoon, watching her press a large hand flat against the cabin wall and feel for the give in the timber. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "I told you I did," he grinned. It was a quick, warm grin that arrived before he could think about it. "You did," he agreed. She looked at his grin for a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. Then she turned back to the wall. The people of Harrow's Crossing began coming back within the first week. The settlement had been scattered by the flood, families staying with relatives in neighboring valleys, but roots are strong things, and a frontier homestead is not abandoned lightly. They came back in ones and twos and small family groups, in wagons loaded with salvage and tools, and they set to work on their own ruins with the grim, set-faced determination of people who have done hard things before and will do hard things again, because there is simply no alternative. And they saw Sharamph Ironhide. The first encounter happened on the fourth day of the rebuilding, when Levi was carrying a salvaged roof beam across the muddy yard, and came around the corner of the cabin to find 3 men from the settlement standing in a loose half-circle at the edge of his property line. He recognized all 3: Caspar Vane, who ran the livery, and the Holloway brothers, Penn and Deckard, who farmed the 2 properties to the north. All 3 were decent enough men in ordinary times. But they were standing with their hands in that particular configuration, not quite on their belt knives but not quite away from them either, and their eyes were fixed on Sharamph, who was up on the partial roof with a hammer, replacing a section of shingles with calm, methodical strokes. "Stone," Caspar said without looking away from her. "Caspar," Levi said, setting the beam down and straightening up. "You men cleaning up all right? What is that on your roof?" Penn Holloway said. "She is helping me with repairs," Levi said. "Her name is Sharamph Ironhide." Sharamph had stopped hammering. She was looking down at the men in the yard with her amber eyes steady and her face giving nothing. "Is an orc," Deckard said, as if this was information Levi might have missed. "I can see that," Levi said pleasantly. "Stone, she should not be here," Caspar said. "Not in the settlement. After the Kelford raid last spring, people are not going to." "The Kelford raid was done by the Stonecrown clan," Levi said, keeping his voice even, "which is 200 miles northeast of here and has no connection to this woman." "She is an orc," Deckard said again, and this time there was something harder in it. Levi took 2 unhurried steps forward until he was standing fully between the 3 men and the cabin wall, and he looked at them with those sad brown eyes that right now were not sad at all. "She is a guest on my land," he said. "My land, such as it is after the flood. She is working here with my thanks and my invitation, and I will ask you 3 to speak to her with the same courtesy you would show any neighbor, or you can take your opinions and go work on your own properties, which I expect also need considerable attention." The silence stretched. A bird called somewhere in the flooded fields. Sharamph's hammer resumed its measured work on the roof, one clear stroke after another. Caspar Vane looked from Levi to the roof and back. He let out a slow breath through his nose. "You always were stubborn, Stone," he said. "I have been told," Levi said. The 3 men left. Sharamph watched them go from the roof without expression. When they were out of earshot, she looked down at Levi. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I did actually," he said. He picked up the beam again. "Pass me the end of that rope, will you?" That evening, when the light went copper and the hammering was done for the day, they sat on the repaired section of the porch step with tin cups of river water boiled over the fire, which was all there was in the way of refreshment, and Sharamph said, quietly, "No one has done that for me before, stood like that." Levi looked at her. She was looking at the sunset, the way it set the clouds behind the Harrows Range into colors that you could not quite name, orange shading to rose shading to something almost violet at the edge. "Then the people you have been around have been poor examples," he said. She was quiet for a long time. "My clan," she said finally, "was destroyed in a battle last winter, not by humans, by another orc clan, the Ironthroat, who wanted our forge secrets. My father was the forge master. He died in the first hour." She said this without any change in her tone, which was somehow worse than if she had wept. "Those of us who survived scattered. I came south because I had no north to go back to." Levi held his cup in both hands and did not say anything trite or hollow. He said, "That is a terrible weight to carry." "It is," she said. Then very quietly, "It is a little lighter tonight." He did not press that. He let it settle between them like something precious and new, and they watched the sky go dark together. The rebuilding took 3 weeks in earnest, and by the end of it the cabin was not merely livable but genuinely sound, sounder than it had been before the flood if Levi was honest, because Sharamph's understanding of structure had caught weaknesses in the original build that he would never have known to look for. The floor was relaid in the main room and kitchen. The door frame was reset true. The eastern foundation was shored up with stones hauled from the river's gravel bar by the 2 of them together. Sharamph carrying loads that would have broken most men, not showing off but simply working at her natural capacity, which was considerable. She slept in the barn, or rather in the partial shelter of what would eventually become the barn again, on a bedroll she had salvaged from her original camp gear. He had offered the cabin, which at that point had one functional room, and she had declined with quiet firmness, and he respected that. But they ate together every evening without discussion or planning, simply because the fire was central and the food was communal, and it would have been strange not to. They fell into a routine that had the comfortable, easy quality of something that has been practiced for a long time, even though it had not, and this fact was not lost on either of them. She had a dry, precise humor that surfaced unexpectedly, usually when she was in the middle of some physically demanding task, and therefore least expected to be funny. He laughed at it every time, genuinely, without self-consciousness, and she watched him laugh with an expression he could not quite read but that he knew was not displeasure. He caught her watching him work sometimes. Not constantly, not obviously, but in those moments when she thought he was not looking, he would glance up from the timber he was shaping or the nail he was driving and find her amber eyes on him with an expression that was very quiet and very intent. When he caught her at it, she did not look away quickly or pretend she had been looking at something else. She simply shifted her gaze with a kind of unhurried dignity and went back to what she was doing. He did not say anything about it, but he noticed. On a Tuesday in the 4th week, with the cabin mostly done and the question of her continuing west hanging in the air between them like weather about to break, Levi went into the settlement to trade some salvaged iron fittings for food supplies. He was standing at the outdoor counter of what remained of the trading post, now operating from a tent on the trading post's footprint, when he overheard two women talking behind the canvas partition that served as a wall. "Stone's orc," one of them said, in the low voice that people use when they mean to be heard from just far enough away to claim they were not. "She is not his," the other said. "She is just there while he gets set up again." Emma Sykes said she came into the trading post yesterday and asked for twine, just walked right in like she belonged. "She paid for it, I heard." "That is not the point." Levi straightened his back and turned around to face the two women who were the wives of Penn and Deckard Holloway respectively. They went pink when they saw him looking. "I would appreciate it," he said, conversationally and without particular heat, "if you would speak about my guest by name when you speak about her at all. Her name is Sharamph Ironhide. She is a skilled tradesperson who has helped me rebuild my property and has been nothing but decent to everyone she has met here." The women looked at him and looked at each other. "People are just worried, Levi," one of them said. "People can be worried on their own time and on their own property," he said. "Sharamph Ironhide does not answer for the Kelford raid or for any other act committed by people she has never met. She answers for herself and her account is good." He picked up his wrapped parcel of supplies. "Good day." He carried the supplies home and set them on the cabin porch. Sharamph was doing something at the far end of the property, driving stakes for a new fence line, her dark hair tied back and her leather bodice catching the afternoon light. He stood and watched her for a moment. The question of her leaving was going to have to be addressed. Every day she stayed was a day he had not asked, and every day she stayed was a day he was more aware of the shape her presence had taken in the architecture of his days. How quiet the mornings were before she was up, and how different the quality of the air was when he could hear her moving around, working or humming under her breath, or talking to the horses she had gentle, practical conversations with as she worked around them. He walked down to where she was driving stakes. "Stay through winter," he said. She stopped mid-swing and looked at him. The hammer was still raised. "What?" she said. "Stay through winter," he said again. "The border towns will not hire well until spring anyway. The roads are poor and the weather is coming and I need—" He paused. "I would like the help, and you need a place to winter that is not a tent." She lowered the hammer slowly. "You are certain?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I am," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, that amber gaze that always felt like it was measuring something she was not going to share the results of right away. "I will need space in the barn for a forge," she said, finally. "I have been thinking about setting one up. There is enough scrap iron in this valley after the flood to work with for months." "I can build you a forge bay," he said. "I know you can," she said. "I will tell you how to do it properly." "I would expect nothing less," he said. She went back to driving the stake, and he stood there for another moment before he turned to go back to the cabin, and he was almost certain, without being able to see her face, that she was smiling. October came in cold and bright, the frost arriving without ceremony and making the morning spectacular, all silver grass and blue sky, and the Harrow's Range standing up sharp and white-capped to the west. The cabin was done and warm, and the forge bay was built into the barn's west end, and Sharamph had begun working the iron, and the settlement had begun, with the slow and grudging reluctance of any frontier community being asked to revise a long-held belief, to come to her with bent plows and broken hinges and cracked axle fittings. It started with necessity. After the flood, everyone's equipment was in various states of ruin, and the nearest proper smithy was 20 miles east at Cartwell, which was a long trip for a bent plowshare when there was a skilled smith right here. The first man who came was old Fenwick Marsh himself, the trading post owner, who had his hat in his hands and his dignity in a complicated arrangement with his practical need for a new latch assembly on his rebuilt post door. Sharamph looked at the broken pieces he laid on her workbench. She told him what it would cost in materials and time. She did not smile at him or try to soften herself for his comfort. She was simply precise, professional, and competent. He came back the next day, watched her work for a while without being invited to, and left without comment. When he picked up the finished latch assembly 2 days later, he said, "Good work," with the particular compression of a man who does not use words freely, and Sharamph received this with a nod that was equally compressed, and the deal was concluded. After Marsh came the Holloways, and after the Holloways came the Dyers and the Pecks, and by November there was a quiet, unannounced, but clearly understood arrangement in the settlement that Sharamph Ironhide did the smithing work and did it well, and was not to be bothered about anything else. This was not acceptance, not fully, not yet, but it was the frontier's version of a first step. Inside the cabin through those weeks, the evenings were extraordinary, though neither of them would have described it that way aloud. They ate together, and sometimes Levi read aloud from the 3 books he owned, a history of the early frontier settlements, an almanac, and a battered book of old poems that he was slightly embarrassed about but produced one evening when Sharamph said she had never much had access to written words. She had learned to read in her own language, but human letters had always been scarce in her world. So he read to her. He started with the almanac, which she found genuinely useful, and moved to the history, which she engaged with sharp, sometimes pointed commentary about the way it described Orc involvement in the border wars. And then one evening he produced the poetry book and read from it a little defensively, and she sat across from him at the table and listened with her chin in her hand and her eyes on the fire. And when he finished a particular verse about winter stars and distance and the small lights that people carry against the dark, she was quiet for a long time. "Read that one again," she said. He did. She did not explain why she wanted it again, and he did not ask. But when he closed the book that evening and they said their quiet good nights, she reached out as she passed him on her way to the barn and touched the back of his hand with just the tips of her fingers, brief and warm and completely deliberate. He stood very still after she was gone, looking at the back of his own hand. November deepened. The first real snow came on a Saturday, falling thick and quiet and draping the valley in a silence that had weight to it. Levi had been working on the fence line at the field's edge when it started, and by the time he got back to the barn he was covered in it, and he pushed the barn door open to find Sharamph already there, having come in from the smithing work. Standing at the small wood stove he had installed in the forge bay, holding her hands out to the warmth. She turned when he came in, saw the state of him, snow-dusted and pink-cheeked and clearly unprepared for how seriously the sky had meant it, and she made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Low and warm and real, the first proper laugh he had heard from her in the 6 weeks she had been here, and it hit him somewhere under the sternum with an almost physical force. "There is hot water on the stove," she said, still smiling, and it was a remarkable thing, her smile, the way it transformed her face not into something softer but into something more fully itself. "Thank you," he said. He did not move toward the stove. He was looking at her, she noticed. The smile changed slightly, not going away but becoming something else, something aware. The snow fell outside. The horses shifted in their stalls. The small stove threw its warmth into the space between them. "Levi," she said. "Sharamph," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. Then she turned back to the stove and said practically, "Come warm your hands before you lose the feeling in them." And the moment shifted into something gentler and less exposed, and he walked over and stood beside her at the stove, close enough that the length of his arm was nearly touching hers, and they warmed their hands together in silence. That was the night she did not go back to the barn. It was not romance that kept her, not then, not exactly. The snow had settled in too hard for the walk across the yard to be sensible, and he had set up the pallet near the hearth without any ceremony, laying out extra blankets and saying that the barn was cold and the storm was real, and she should stay where there was a fire, and she had accepted this with her usual directness. He gave her the pallet and took the chair by the fire himself, and he sat reading his almanac while she lay on her side with her back to him, and the fire crackled, and the snow tapped at the window. Said after a long silence in a voice that was almost at the edge of sleep, "My father used to say that a warm fire in a storm is proof that not all small things are small." Levi closed the almanac. "Your father sounds like a good man." "He was," she said. "He would have liked you." He held that carefully. "Why?" he asked very quietly. "Because you build things," she said, "and because you are not afraid of what you do not understand. You just try to understand it." He said nothing for a while. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "Yes," she said. But he sat by the fire for another hour after he heard her breathing go slow and even, watching the flames and thinking about her father and forge masters and small things that were not small. December arrived, and with it a tension in the settlement that Levi had been watching approach since October. There was a council of the Harrows Crossing landowners, a loose thing held every winter to discuss the collective concerns of the community, and this year it had a specific item on its agenda that someone had apparently added without informing Levi. He found out about it the morning of the council day, when Penn Holloway rode by and mentioned it as if it were settled news. "Settlement Council voted last night to ask the Orc woman to move on before New Year's," Penn said from the back of his horse, looking at a point somewhere above Levi's head. Levi went very still. "The council voted," he said, "without notifying every landholder in the settlement." Penn shifted. There was a gathering at Vane's place." "Casper's place is not the settlement hall," Levi said, "and I own land in this settlement and I was not notified." He looked up at Penn Holloway with eyes that were doing something other than being sad. "Tell Casper I will be at the settlement hall at 2 o'clock, and tell him to bring whoever he gathered at his house." Penn left quickly. Levi went to the forge bay where Sharamph was working, feeding iron into the fire with long tongs, her face lit copper by the forge's glow. "There is a problem," he said. She looked at him. He told her directly and without softening it. She listened. When he finished, she set down the tongs with a careful, controlled click. "I will go," she said. Her voice was level. "If they want me gone, Levi, I do not want to be the cause of trouble for you." "No," he said. She looked at him, startled by the brevity and the certainty of it. "No," he said again. "This is not their decision to make. You are on my land, you are doing lawful work, and you have done nothing wrong. I am going to the hall at 2 o'clock, and I am going to say that. They will make your life difficult," she said. They will make it difficult for a while and then they will find something else to be concerned about, he said. That is how people work. Levi, Sharamph. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw was set, and her amber eyes were very bright and very conflicted, the look of someone who has learned the hard way that depending on other people's protection usually ends in a particular kind of pain, and who is being presented with evidence that this once, be different. "All right," she said, very quietly. At 2 o'clock Levi Stone walked to the settlement hall, which was the largest of the rebuilt structures, a long log building that served as meeting house and market space. 11 men were there, the Holloways and Vane and Marsh, and a handful of others, standing in a cluster that rearranged itself when he walked in. He could feel the shape of what they had planned, the practiced reasonableness that was meant to make an unreasonable thing palatable. He did not let them frame it. "This is my property and Sharamph Ironhide is on it with my invitation," he said, before anyone else could speak. "She is a free person engaged in lawful trade. She has committed no offense. I want to understand what law or covenant gives this council the authority to remove a free person from private land." Caspar Vane took a breath. "Levi, after the Kelford raid was committed by specific individuals who have been identified and are not this woman," Levi said. "If one of your hands committed a crime, I would not demand that every man in the settlement leave." "It is not the same. Tell me precisely how it is not the same," Levi said. "I will wait." The silence that followed was the most productive silence Levi had ever presided over. Caspar opened his mouth once and closed it again. Old Marsh looked at his boots. Pen Holloway found something interesting to examine on the ceiling beam. "She is providing skilled smithing work to this settlement at fair prices," Levi continued. "Half the plows you are going to need working next spring are going to need her hands on them. I suggest we discuss what it would mean to lose her before we consider any further action." He stood there and he did not waver and he did not apologize, and the meeting dissolved eventually into a kind of exhausted non-decision, which was as much as he had hoped for. No formal vote, no order, just the slow, grudging retreat of people who had been planning on a certain kind of resistance and found it suddenly unavailable. He walked home through the cold afternoon air and the snow creaked under his boots and the sky was low and gray and enormous. Sharamph was standing in the yard when he came back. She had not gone to the forge. She was standing with her arms folded across her leather bodice, watching him come up the path, and when he got close enough to see her face he could see that she had been managing something very difficult and doing it with considerable effort. "Well," she said. "No vote," he said. "No order." She let out a breath. It was visible in the cold air. "You did not have to do that," she said for the second time since they had met. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." They stood in the yard in the cold, looking at each other, and the thing between them that had been building for weeks, that had been in every evening by the fire and every morning working side by side, and every touch and every look and every poem read aloud, pressed itself against the surface of the moment with a sudden and unmistakable insistence. He was the one who moved first, stepping forward and reaching out and cupping her jaw in his hand, his callous thumb tracing the strong line of her cheekbone, the slightly cooler green of her skin against the warmth of his palm, and she looked at him with those amber eyes that were not calculating anything right now, that were simply open and searching and very present. He kissed her. It was not impulsive. It was the most deliberate thing he had done in months, tilting his head and pressing his mouth to hers gently and firmly, and she went very still for one brief moment, and then kissed him back, her hand coming up to grip the front of his coat with a careful, questioning strength, and the cold air was around them and the gray sky was above them, and neither of them moved away. When they separated, it was only by the smallest margin, still close enough that their breath mixed in the winter air between them. "I should have done that weeks ago," he said. "Yes," she said, and her voice was rougher than usual. "You should have." He laughed because she made him laugh, and she made a sound against his neck that might have been a laugh or might have been a sigh, and he held her there in the yard in the cold, and the settlement was around them, and the mountains were in the distance, and the river that had taken everything ran in the distance, and none of it felt like loss right now. Winter settled in around them like a living thing, something patient and encompassing that pushed them closer together by pure logic and geography. She moved her bedroll into the cabin without announcement, simply because the barn was too cold, and the arrangement on the pallet had become understood between them as something that did not need to be negotiated. They were careful with each other, careful in the way of two people who are aware that what they are building is precious and cannot afford to be careless. They talked in the evenings until late, and the conversations ranged far, across her clan's history and his family's history and the politics of the border wars, and the best way to make bread with limited stores, and the names of stars, and the mechanics of a good weld, and the question of what it meant to build a life from nothing. He told her about his parents, his father who had come west with a wagon and a plan and died of fever when Levi was 12, leaving him to finish growing up on the frontier with his mother's practical instruction and stubborn love. His mother had died 4 years ago, and this farm had been his alone since. No one since. Sharamph asked one evening without particular inflection. There was a woman in Cartwell a few years back, he said. She was not interested in the frontier. She wanted someone who was going somewhere. I was not going anywhere. Sharamph looked at the fire. Are you going somewhere now? He looked at her. I think so, he said. I think I might be. She absorbed this without comment, but the quality of the silence that followed was warm rather than empty. In January, during the deep of winter when the cold was so serious that the Barrow froze solid and you could walk across it, Levi fell ill. It came on fast, the way serious illness does in the cold months, a fever that had him shaking in his bunk within a day of the first symptoms. Sharamph recognized the signs and took charge without hesitation, hauling snow to melt for water, keeping the fire at a consistent heat, sourcing dried willow bark from the settlement's healer. A taciturn woman named Greta Fenn, who appeared at the door, took in the situation with one comprehensive look, handed over her medicine satchel and said, "You look like you know what you are doing," which from Greta Fenn was high praise. Sharamph sat with him through the worst 3 days. She slept in the chair when he finally slept, waking at any change in his breathing, laying cool cloths on his forehead, and making him drink broth from the one chicken she had quietly bartered for from the dyers. She talked to him when he was feverish and confused, her low voice a steady anchor, and she told him things she had not told him when he was well, things about her father's forged songs and the way the clan gathered at midsummer, and the first time she had ever made a complete blade from raw iron and her forge master's particular, minimalist praise. On the 4th day the fever broke and he looked up at her with clear eyes and saw how tired she was, the particular weariness of someone who has not truly slept in 72 hours. "Go sleep," he said. His voice was a ruin, but it was his voice. "Not yet," she said. "Sharamph, I will sleep when I know you are all right." He reached out and took her hand, her strong, calloused, extraordinary hand, and held it, and she let him, and he said, "I am all right. You stayed." "Of course I stayed," she said, and she said it with a fierceness that caught her own voice, and he understood it fully, what staying meant to someone who had lost everything and everyone and still chose to remain. He pulled her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles gently, and she closed her amber eyes. "Sleep," he said. She stretched out beside him on the bunk, still in her clothes, and was asleep in minutes. He lay beside her in the narrow space and watched the fire, and thought that there was not a single thing in his life that the flood had taken that he would trade for this. Spring came the way it always does on the frontier, suddenly and with a kind of violent enthusiasm that makes everything feel possible. The mud came first, then the green, and then the whole valley shook off its winter silence and filled with birds and the smell of turned earth and the sound of people who had survived another winter returning to the business of building and growing. Levi plowed. Sharamph worked the forge. They moved around each other's days with the easy rhythm of something long established, though it was barely 6 months. He brought her morning tea. She left his tools in order when she borrowed them, which was not the case before she arrived. They argued twice, about real things. Once about the best routing for the new fence line, which ended with her being right. Once about a debt he was considering taking on to purchase seed stock, which ended with her being right again, and him being gracious enough to say so after a day's consideration, which made her look at him with an expression of surprised warmth that made him want to argue with her more often just for the making up of it. In March, when the snow was gone from everything except the highest peaks, Levi rode into Cartwell for supplies and came back with something he had not told her he was going for. He came to the forge where she was deep in work, finishing a set of plow fittings for the dyers, and he waited in the doorway until she looked up. She saw his expression and set down the hammer. "What?" she said. He crossed the forge to her and he held out a ring. It was iron which he had pulled from the salvage after the flood, worked into a smooth band with a small, neat inlay of hammered copper. He had made it in secret, badly at first, then better, over a period of 2 weeks when she was asleep or out at the far end of the property. Sharamph Ironhide looked at the ring in his palm. Her face went through approximately 4 things in 4 seconds, all of them too complex to name. "Levi Stone," she said. "I know," he said. "I know there are 100 arguments about it. The settlement, the difficulty, your plans for the border towns, all of it. I know. And I am not saying any of those arguments are wrong. I am saying that I have built this place up from nothing once before and I am doing it again, and every single part of the rebuilding that has meant anything to me has had you in it, and I would like," he stopped and started again. "I would like you to stay. Not as a guest and not as a helper, as my partner, as the person who is here because she chooses to be here permanently with me." She was looking at the ring. Her jaw was set and her amber eyes were very bright. "I am an orc," she said, and it came out almost like a question or like something she was reminding him of in case he had somehow not been paying attention. "I am aware," he said. "I was there on the roof." A sound came from her that was almost a laugh. "People will talk. People already talk," he said. "They will talk less in time and we will care less as time goes on." "Your children," she said. "Any children would be half-orc," he said steadily. "Yes, and I would consider that a fine beginning." She looked at him then fully, without the careful management she usually employed, without the measurement or the guard, just her face as it was, open and honest and overwhelmed. "That ring," she said, "is the worst smithing work I have ever seen." "I know," he said. "The inlay kept slipping. I would have done it completely differently. I know that too. The copper needs to be set at a lower temperature or it pits." "Sharamph." "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes." "Yes," she said again, and she took the ring from his palm and put it on her own finger and looked at it for a moment, sitting very badly, which he could see. And then she looked up at him, and her smile was so full and so real that it remade his understanding of what her smile could be. He stepped forward and kissed her properly, both hands in her hair, and she pulled him in by the front of his coat the way she had that first time in the yard, but with no questioning in it now, none at all, only certainty. They were married at the end of March, at the settlement hall, in a small and not entirely comfortable ceremony attended by about half the settlement, which was more than either of them had expected. Greta Fenn performed the service, because Greta Fenn was the closest thing Harrow's Crossing had to an official anything, and she did it with her characteristic lack of sentiment and her deep underlying decency, pronouncing them joined in partnership under the Frontier Covenant with the air of someone closing a ledger entry. Old Marsh was there in the back, with his hat in his lap. He nodded at Sharamph when the ceremony ended and she met his eyes and nodded back, and that was the whole of it, but it was something. That night, in the cabin that they had rebuilt together from the wreckage of the flood, with the fire burning and the spring rain tapping gentle at the new window, something shifted between them that had been waiting, patiently and with considerable patience, for the right moment. She was still in the fitted leather bodice and the rust linen blouse, the closest thing she owned to a formal outfit, and he thought she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen in his life. He thought this with a completeness that had nothing theoretical about it. He crossed the room to her slowly, giving her every moment to choose, and she chose him, meeting him in the middle of the room with her hands against his chest and her amber eyes up and steady and warm. And what happened between them then was everything that the long winter and the long months of careful building had been leading toward, slow and tender and deeply felt. The warmth of two people who have truly seen each other choosing to be close without any remaining distance. He held her face in both hands and kissed her as if he had been saving it, and she made a sound low in her throat that undid him in the best possible way. He drew her close, and she was strong and warm and real against him, and the words that passed between them were quiet and private and not for any world but theirs. The fire burned low and the rain continued, and the spring night was soft around the cabin, and when they lay still together in the quiet afterward, her head against his shoulder and his arm around her, both of them looking at the low-lit ceiling with the peaceful, full silence of people who have arrived somewhere they intended to be. He pressed his lips to her temple, and she turned her face up toward him, and he thought that the river had taken everything and given him this. And no calculation in the universe produced that as a fair trade in his favor. "Levi," she said. "I know," he said, though she had not finished the sentence. She made a sound of quiet contentment. "Yes," she said. "That is what I meant." Summer arrived and made the valley extraordinary. Levi's fields came in better than they had in years, partly because Sharamph had studied the drainage of the property with a forge master's eye for the movement of materials, and had suggested a rerouting of the irrigation trench that increased the water flow to the east field considerably. She was not a farmer and said so without apology, but she understood systems and principles, and she applied them to the farm's problems with a thoroughness that produced results. The forge was doing steady business. Not just plow fittings and hinges now, but decorative ironwork, latches with clean lines, gate hardware, tools with properly balanced handles. Word had spread to the neighboring valleys, and people came from Cartwell and even farther east on occasion, which meant money coming into the property and Sharamph's reputation expanding. There were still incidents. In July, a group of travelers passing through on the western wagon road made some loud and ugly comments in the trading post when Sharamph was there picking up supplies. She handled it herself, with a level of controlled, cold authority that made the three men uncomfortable enough to leave quickly, but Levi, who had been outside at the wagon, saw the shape of the exchange through the tent opening and moved to the doorway, making himself visible, and the encounter ended without further trouble. That evening she said to him, "You did not need to come to the doorway." "I know," he said. "I wanted to be there in case." "I can handle men like that," she said. "I know you can," he said. "That is not why I was there." She looked at him. "I was there because I love you," he said simply. "And I do not like watching people speak to you that way, and I wanted you to be able to see me if you looked up. That is all." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You are very strange." "Probably," he said. "It is a good kind of strange," she said. By autumn she was pregnant, and they knew it by October, and Levi walked around for a week in a state of quiet, luminous stupefaction that Sharamph found both touching and faintly amusing. "You look like you have been struck by something," she told him. "I have been," he said. "You know this is how it works," she said. "I know how it works," he said. "I did not know how it feels." "There is a difference." She was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on her stomach. "There is," she agreed, and her voice was warm. The pregnancy changed the settlement's attitude more than anything else had, which was both predictable and telling, because people on the frontier understand children and the forming of families in a way that is visceral and instinctive, and a child coming meant roots going deeper, and deep roots meant permanence, and permanence meant neighbor, and neighbor meant something different than stranger. Greta Finn came by in November and had a long, practical conversation with Sharamph about orc pregnancy, which ran somewhat shorter than human pregnancy, and somewhat more intensely in the final stages. Greta had delivered 2 half-orc children in her career, and she was matter-of-fact about the differences, which Sharamph appreciated enormously. "You are useful," Sharamph told her, which from Sharamph was the highest praise. Greta Fenn looked at her steadily and said, "So are you." And Sharamph understood that this was Greta's way of saying something that Greta was constitutionally incapable of saying directly, and she accepted it in the spirit it was offered. Winter arrived again, the second winter, and it was easier than the first in every way that mattered. The cabin was warm and well-stocked. The property was generating enough income that they had been able to buy proper provision for the cold months. Sharamph, now visibly pregnant and moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing an altered center of gravity, had slowed her forge work to lighter pieces and more planning work, sketching designs on paper and preparing orders to fill when she was ready to work at full capacity again. Levi worked the property and spent the evenings reading to her, and their conversations had expanded to include speculation about the child, what he or she would be like, what they would want, what the world they were bringing this person into could be made into. "It will be hard for them," Sharamph said one evening. "Half-orc in a human settlement, half-human in an orc world if there is any orc world left to them." "Yes," he said. He was not going to lie to her. "It will be hard. Some people will be unkind. But," she said, because she could hear it in his pause, "but their parents will be the kind of people that other parents will tell their children about," he said. "The kind that stayed and built something when everything was lost. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. "You are sometimes insufferably right," she said. "Only sometimes," he said. Their son was born in late February, with Greta Fenn in attendance and Levi nearby, closer than Greta technically preferred but firmly unwilling to be further. He was born with his mother's amber eyes and his father's dark hair, and a faint green tinge to his skin that would deepen as he grew. He was healthy and loud and very clearly himself from the first moment, which Sharamph said with an expression of utter exhausted wonder that Levi would remember for the rest of his life. They named him Aldrich. It was a name from neither tradition precisely, but from the pool of old frontier names that belonged to the land they were on, and that felt right. Harrow's Crossing in those years after the flood was changing, the way frontier settlements change, which is slowly and then suddenly and without ever quite announcing it. New families came. The trading post was properly rebuilt, a solid log structure with a porch. A school was started in the settlement hall on winter mornings. The roads improved. The valley filled in. And at the center of it, quietly and without making speeches about it, was the Stone property, the farm and the forge, the woman at the anvil who made the best ironwork in 3 valleys, and the man who plowed the south field with the kind of steady, unhurried commitment that made everything around him grow. Aldrich grew up moving between the forge and the field with the easy belonging of a child who has never been told he does not fit, because his parents had worked very hard to ensure that he experienced that message as rarely as possible. And when it came anyway, as it sometimes did, he had his mother's controlled authority and his father's patient stubbornness to fall back on, which were, it turned out, exactly the right tools. By the time Aldrich was 4, Sharamph was pregnant again, this time with a girl, who arrived in summer with her mother's green skin and her mother's amber eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and whom they named Aurea, for the way the morning light hit the forge fire. The settlement had, by now, simply accepted them. Not universally, not without the occasional backward glance or muttered word from a traveler passing through who did not know the local order of things. But within Harrow's Crossing, the Stone family was simply the Stone family, and Sharamph Ironhide was simply the smith, and the general view, unannounced and unvoted upon, was that whatever private opinions people held about the nature of their marriage and the color of their children's skin were best kept private. This was not a complete or perfect thing. The world did not become suddenly just because two people loved each other, but it moved. Incrementally, imperfectly, in the way of all real change. It moved. In the 5th year after the flood, an extraordinary thing happened. A family of half-orc travelers, a human man and an orc woman and their 3 children, stopped at Harrow's Crossing during a westward journey and were looking for a place to water their horses and buy provisions. They were nervous when they pulled up to the trading post, the orc woman in particular carrying herself with the braced stillness of someone prepared for hostility. Sharamph was at the trading post herself, picking up a supply of charcoal for the forge. She saw them and she crossed the yard to them, and she spoke in her own language to the orc woman, a brief exchange that visibly recalibrated something fundamental in the other woman's posture, and then she invited the whole family to the Stone property for a meal and a proper rest. They came. They stayed 2 nights. The children played in the yard with Aldrich and infant Aurea, and the general noise and chaos of this was one of those ordinary extraordinary things that Levi would remember. When the family left to continue west, the orc woman gripped Sharamph's forearm in the orc way of farewell, formal and deep, and said something that Levi did not understand. He asked later. She said that she was glad to know that such a place existed, Sharamph said. A place where people like us are home. He looked at her. She is right, he said. We are home. Sharamph looked around the yard at the repaired cabin with its solid new porch, the forge bay in the barn where the fire never quite went fully cold, the fence line they had built together, the fields greening up in the summer light, the distant line of the Harrows Range still white at its peaks even in June. Yes, she said. We are. The years moved on. Aldrich grew into a boy with his mother's precision and his father's warmth, fascinated by the forge and useful in it by age 7, when he was allowed to pump the bellows and watch, but not yet to handle tools without supervision. Aurea, as she grew past the baby stage, showed every sign of being someone with very decided opinions, which Levi and Sharamph found both challenging and deeply familiar. The farm produced. The forge produced. The property expanded when Levi purchased the adjacent plot from the Holloway estate after Penn Holloway died, and his brother Deckert moved east, which gave them good growing land to the north. Caspar Vane, who had been the most vocal opponent of Sharamph's presence in those early days, came to the forge one morning with a broken wheel hub and stood on the threshold with his hat in his hand and said, "The Ironhide smithing. I hear you are the best in 3 valleys now." Sharamph, who had been working with her back to him, turned and looked at him with her amber eyes direct and her expression giving nothing. "I am the best in this valley," she said. "I cannot speak for the others as I have not worked them." Caspar almost smiled. "Fair enough," he said. He held up the wheel hub. "Can you fix this?" "Bring it to the bench," she said. He came in. He watched her assess the damage and begin work. He did not make conversation, and neither did she. When the hub was fixed and he paid her the fair price she named, he looked at it, turned it over, and said, "Good work." She looked up from the anvil. "You said that to Marsh once," she said. "After the latch." He looked startled. "I remember," she said. He met her eyes for the first time. "I owe you an apology," he said, blunt and direct, the way of frontier men who have finally decided a thing. She set down the hammer and folded her arms and considered him. "You do," she said. "I am making it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, the same nod she had given Marsh. "Is accepted," she said. He left and she watched him go, and Levi, who had been in the hayloft and had heard the whole thing through the gap in the planks, allowed himself a quiet and profound satisfaction. That evening he told her what he had overheard. She gave him the look she reserved for times when he was being slightly annoying, which he had come to cherish. "You were eavesdropping," she said. "I was in the hayloft," he said. "Where I was supposed to be, I could not help hearing. You could have made a noise." "I could have," he agreed. She sighed through her nose. "Was it satisfying?" "Enormously," he said. She reached over and took a piece of bread from his plate without asking, which was one of her habits, and he loved all her habits, even the ones that were objectively inconsiderate. "Good," she said. In the 7th year after the flood, the Barrow River rose again. not with the same catastrophic force as that terrible night, but enough to make everyone in the valley watch the waterline and talk about it. Levi and Sharamph watched it together from the east bank of the property, standing side by side the way they stood, close enough for their shoulders to touch, watching the brown water push against its banks. "Not today," Sharamph said. "No," he agreed. "Not today." The river stayed within its banks. The year turned. Aldrich started formal school lessons in the settlement hall. Oria discovered she could climb the apple tree and refused to come down from it, which became a daily point of negotiation. The seasons came and went, and each one left something new in its wake. The farm was fuller. The forge was busier. The family was more itself with every year, more settled into the particular shape of who they were. The human farmer with the sad eyes that were not sad at all when you knew him, and the orc smith with the amber eyes and the dry humor and the extraordinary hands, and their two children who were both and neither and entirely their own. Levi sometimes sat on the cabin porch in the early morning, when the light was new and the valley was quiet and the Harrow's range was pink at its peaks, and he thought about the night of the flood, the terror of it, the cold water and the dark, and then the woman on the wagon wheel with her fingers of iron and her amber eyes, looking at him like he was something she had not anticipated. He had not anticipated her either. He had not anticipated any of it. The staying, the building, the ring made badly from salvaged iron, the children with their mother's eyes, the life that had grown up from mud and flood wreckage into something so full it sometimes caught him off guard in the middle of ordinary days, and filled his chest with a warmth he did not have adequate language for. One evening in autumn, with Aldrich and Oria asleep in the loft room they shared, and the harvest done and the forge banked for the night, Levi and Sharamph sat on the porch, steps the way they had sat on the porch steps 7 years ago with their tin cups and the drowned valley around them. The cups were better now. The view was better now, the fence lines true, the outbuildings solid, the fields showing the productive tidiness of land that is well tended and well loved. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. "Do you still think about West?" he said. He had wondered it for years and had never asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," she said, "I think about the person who was going west, what she was running toward, what she thought she was looking for. What was she looking for?" Sharamph was quiet for long enough that the evening stars appeared at the edge of the sky over the eastern hills, 1 and then 3 and then more. "A place to belong to," she said finally. Work that mattered, people who did not look at her like a problem. He held her a little closer. Did she find it? She turned her face up toward him, and in the evening light her amber eyes were the color of the forge fire, deep and warm and steady. "She found something better," she said. "She found a person who jumped into a river for her, and then she stayed." He kissed her temple, her cheek, the corner of her jaw, and she turned the rest of the way toward him and kissed him properly, with the same thoroughness and intention that she brought to everything she did. And the autumn night was around them, and the stars were beginning their slow turn overhead, and the river ran in its channel where it belonged, quiet and obedient, and nothing like it had been on that terrible, and as it turned out, necessary night when it took everything he had and gave him everything that mattered. The flood had taken every plank of floor, every jar of stores, every seed and tool and blanket and book. It had taken the portrait of his mother and the iron pot and the security of 4 years' work. It had taken everything he owned, and Sharamph Ironhide had stayed, which was, as her father had said about warm fires in storms, not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole of everything. They sat together on the porch until the stars were fully out and the night was properly cool, and then they went inside, and the fire was low and warm, and the children were sleeping in their loft, and the farm was quiet around the cabin, and the forge would be lit again in the morning, and the fields would be plowed again in spring, and the river would stay in its banks this year and perhaps for many years. And the life they had built from the muddy ruins of a flood was so full and so real and so completely and permanently theirs that the loss that had made it possible had long since stopped feeling like loss and had become simply the first chapter of a story that was nowhere near its end. Nowhere near it at all.